Hello again! If you have seen last week's video about photographing Hong Kong, you saw me taking this photo here using the Canon TS-E 17mm tilt-shift lens. And in that video I explain how and why I use that lens to create this Vertorama. What I didn't tell you though was what an actual pain it was taking that photo with that lens. I had rendered it assuming that I could use the shift mechanism to change the frame and do this without tilting or moving the camera around, and I knew that this would allow me to easily stitch the Vertorama using Photoshop. And I'll actually show you how I did this at the end of the video. But what I didn't know was that if I shifted this lens more than 6 or 7 millimeters in any direction, that the sharpness towards the edges would be severely reduced. So much that the photos I took that evening when I also recorded the behind the scenes were completely unusable. And yeah, when I was at the hotel and checking the footage, zooming into the photos, I was very disappointed and yeah, even shocked. So let me just show you what I mean. So this photo was taken on the first evening where I also recorded the behind the scenes video, and I took it right after taking or finishing the Vertorama. So this is just a vertical frame where I shifted upwards at around 8 or 9 millimeters. So not going to the extremes. I think the TS-E lens, you can shift it up or down 12 millimeters, though the maximum is 12 and I was at 8 or 9 here. And yeah, as I looked at this photo on my laptop in the hotel, I first thought it's quite usable, so I didn't have the most spectacular sky. It wasn't ideal, but it looked okay and I thought I could make something out of it. But then I zoomed in and yeah, first looked at the lower part, checked that everything was sharp and yeah, it looked okay. And as I moved upwards to the edges, what I noticed was that the sharpness was completely gone. So I was quite shocked by this because this image is completely unusable, and the same was true for the Vertorama. The upper frames I shot were completely unsharp, so I couldn't use any of the photos I took that evening. And at first I thought there might have been a problem with the lens I got, or that I had some tilt on the lens, but everything was set up correctly. So yeah, I didn't really know what was going on there. So I asked some of my contacts on Facebook, and some of them suggested that it's quite normal that if you shift such a lens too much to the extremes, the sharpness would be reduced. And it's basically as if you would use a very wide angle lens and you go to the edges of the frame, and yeah, usually there you also notice some reduction of sharpness, but yeah, nothing like this. So this is very bad, I think. So I did a few tests with this lens just to see if I could somehow get this photo sharp the next day. So fortunately I was there another 2 days in Hong Kong and I had the lens one more day. So I was planning to reshoot this scene. And for this I did some tests and found out that I could actually get the upper part sharp, but for this I needed to do focus stacking. So doing one more normal focus where I just focused as I would to get the whole scene sharp. And then I would focus just to this part here where I have now this severe unsharpness. And yeah, this actually meant I had to do a little bit more work. But first of all, let me show you this frame again. So I shot this the other day also after taking the Vertorama. And here again, this is the frame which I focused to the lower part, and I can show you side by side. So if I zoom in, the frame where I focused for the complete image, it's completely sharp, and the one where I focused to the upper part is completely unsharp. And if I go up, you see at some point it basically changes. This side is completely unsharp and the other frame is sharp. So for this frame here where I have the vertical image, and in total I had 6, so I had bracketed exposures for both. It's an easy stack, so some blending, some easy focus stack, and yeah, I'll be done in a few minutes for this. But yeah, for the other photo it was a little bit more work, and yeah, I'll show you in a minute. But first, some final verdict about the TS-E lens. So I don't want to be unfair here, or maybe I was just expecting too much of that lens. But yeah, be reminded it actually would cost $1,800 if you buy this lens new, so I was actually expecting it to perform well in any way it can be used. But yeah, let me just give you a short pros and cons of that lens and my final view about it. So a definite pro of that lens is when you're shooting architecture, you can get very unique photos by using the shift mechanism instead of having to tilt your camera. But there's also a con, so some disadvantage to that, because you can't actually shift to the full extent this lens is capable of, because you then lose some of the sharpness or a lot of the sharpness depending how much you shift. So this again introduces additional work, and I think that's actually a big disadvantage. And another disadvantage is this lens is very heavy, so if you bring it along, for me it would mean I have to leave another lens at home because I'm traveling a lot, and 1 kilogram extra is actually a lot for me. Also, it has this huge front element, so you can't use any filters, but also this isn't too bad. I would use this mostly for architecture, and there usually bracketing works quite well, so it's okay. What it's definitely is, it's sharp if you don't shift too much. So the center, the edges, everything, it's very good. You don't have much chromatic aberrations if you're staying within those 6 or 7 millimeters. So if you don't shift too much, then it's a very good lens, But you always have to weigh it against maybe buying a 12 millimeter lens, which would give you a field of view comparable to, or even more than, when I shift this lens around in all directions as much as possible. So true Vertoramas or panoramas give you more megapixels, and if you would use a wide angle lens, or if I would use one, I'd have to crop. But again, weighing the amount of work that was necessary for creating that photo against having in the end just a 36 megapixel photo from the 5 DSR, I'm not sure if it's always worth it. For this occasion here, looking at the photo now, I think it was worth it renting that lens, but I wouldn't buy it. So that's basically my final verdict about it. For me, it's not the right lens, and if you're interested, I definitely suggest that you also rent it, do your own tests, and just then make your educated decision about it. Now I want to show you a little behind the scenes of the processing of this photo. As I said, there were quite a few photos involved, and some of them solely because of the problem I was facing with the TS-E lens. So let's quickly go through the initial selection, which is 29 photos, and I used all of those in some way for the final photo. So the first photo I took here was just a 50-second exposure, the beginning of blue hour for the light trails. And right after that I started with the shift process, though taking the Vertorama, and for all the photos I now had bracketing enabled, so this gave me always 3 photos which I could later blend for HDR and get an extended dynamic range. So this is the lower frame, and then I shifted upwards by I think 4 millimeters to give me this frame. And for those two I didn't do any focus stacking yet, because those are completely sharp, so the problem I was talking about didn't show up yet. But now here, as I shifted further up, it began to become unsharp at the top of the frame. So for this one here. And so in addition to just taking those bracketed exposures, I then did refocus to the upper part and took right afterwards another set of 3 exposures. After having those, I shifted up to the top, so this is the final frame, and again I took a bracketed exposure for background and foreground. And then I left the camera in place, and I wanted to take a few more photos to get a few more cloud patterns, because now that the blue hour had set in, some clouds were finally moving in, and I took a few more photos, also bracketing, until I got enough photos for the clouds, because I like this part here, and I don't know where I used this, I think this upper part. So after having those, I shifted down again, because now I was in the range of 30-second exposures, and I wanted to use those for the light trails in the streets again. So I went back to the initial frame and I took 4 more photos where I just focused on getting nice light trails here from the cars. So a total of 29 photos to start with. So every time when I have such a huge amount of initial photos to work on, it's important for me to have a plan on how to proceed. And it's not like I load every photo into Photoshop and then just start working there. No, it's different stages to the process. And for this selection of photos, what I did first, all the bracketed exposures, I converted them to an HDR, and I actually did this in Lightroom because for this scene where I didn't have much movement aside from the light trails, which I would blend in later, it was easy to do this. And I have a separate tutorial here on YouTube where I show how you can use Lightroom to create HDRs. So I went through all the bracketed exposures and did the HDR, and I ended up with this new selection here. And now it's only 13 photos left. And again, you have here the initial frame with the light trails and then all the HDR photos. So those here are also the light trails which I took at the end. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 light trail photos, and now here are the HDR photos. So that's the lower frame, and the next one, front focus, back focus, front, back, and then the additional frames I took for the clouds. So now it's starting to look a little better, and the next step now was to export those photos to TIFF. Also, I always sync the photos, which I also show in my workflow tutorial. So I exported the photos, and then I had to do the stacking and also putting together the lower frame for the light trails. So in the end, I'd do a panorama of those, but first I needed to put the individual frames together. So for example, blending those 2 photos here, doing a focus stack, then doing a focus stack for those, and also blending in some clouds. And for those light trail images, I just blended them all together to give me the best light trails. Long story short, I ended up with a selection of 4 photos now. So this is the lower frame, which is a combination of the HDR photo and the light trail photos. So bringing in the best of all I had. Then this middle frame, where I just used the HDR photo, because here the lower part will come completely out of this frame, so I don't have to bother about it. Then I have this middle part and the upper part where I blended in the clouds as I needed them. So those 4 photos now are finished and can be used for the panorama stacking in Photoshop. And I'll just show you that. But before, I want to quickly show you the sharpness now. Oops. So let's zoom in here on this frame. And remember, the upper part or the lower part, one of both, was unsharp in the individual frames. But now after the stacking, I have the lower part, and also if we scroll up, the upper part completely sharp. So all the work now, finally we have some usable content for the final photo. So what I could now do with those 4 photos, I could directly do the panoramic stacking here in Lightroom. For this I would just select all of them, go to photo, and then merging of photos and panorama. But actually, since I use this tilt shift lens, those photos will come together very easily, and I don't need to use the automatic stacking in Lightroom. I can have much more control if I do it in Photoshop. And this is what I'm going to show you now. So for this, basically exported those photos, they're already TIFF. And yeah, let's head over to Bridge. And here I also have those 4 photos. And to stack it in Photoshop, what I'll do, I'll use Tools, Photoshop, Photo Merge here. And there's an important setting I have to make. First of all, I was using the tilt shift lens. There will be not any transformations, so curving or whatever you see if you have a cylindrical or spherical panorama, so you can just use perspective here. Also, I'll deselect this blend images together, and with those 2 settings active, the only thing that Photoshop will do, it will load the images and then position the images in a way that they will align. So I can do easy blending between the images by using manual masking afterwards. And I'll not do this automatic feature here because this also involves adjustments to colors and stuff, and it will do hard masks. All in all, it makes the work a lot harder in the end, and I want to have the full flexibility. So I just press OK and let Photoshop do its magic. So here are the layers, and Photoshop already aligned them so they will stack perfectly. Let's quickly look. So if I deactivate one after the other, you see perfectly aligns, and this only works this way because of the tilt shift lens. For normal panoramas using a wide angle lens, this is normally much harder. So I'll just do the manual stacking now. So I start with those two. I put a mask on the upper layer, 100% brush, and I can use a little soft brush, and as I said, with black I bring in the light trails completely from the lower frame. And that's similar to focus stacking now. So I go in close and really decide what part I want from which photo. And by using this soft brush, it will also blend very well, although the images are a little different in terms of color. So if I want to be very clever here, I can also apply some photo filter, clip it to this, and I could adjust it a bit so the colors better match, but I'll not bother here, it's good enough. But if the exposures would be more different, I could do this. So those two are stacked. Now the third one, same process, put a mask on it, and now with 100% brush, just paint in from the bottom. And here I can also decide a bit which clouds I want to use or don't want to use. So I think using a little softer brush here, and yeah, that's already it. Always making sure that the lower part is completely black, just to make sure I don't have any artifacts from the wrong layer. Also for this one, make sure it's black. Okay, so, and now the final one, same process, white mask, 100% black, and yeah, just painting in from the bottom and using a soft brush here. And what I could now do, I could refine this a bit, selecting which parts of the sky I want, which clouds, but yeah, you get the idea, I think. So after this blending is done, let's first clean up the lower part here. So after this is done, I just select everything, I flatten it, Ctrl E, and then I have to correct the perspective here because, as I told you in the behind the scenes video, which I showed you last week, I had to point the camera a little bit upwards, so I have those tilting lines. It's not as bad as if I would be using my wide angle lens, which I would have had to tilt upwards much farther, but it's there and I have to correct it. So I press Ctrl T to bring up the transformation tool, and also here Ctrl R brings up the ruler, and I can draw in some guidelines which helps me to correct the perspective. And now just hold down Control and I can pull out here, also pull in a bit. So just making those lines straight. And also on this side. And yeah, that's already it. Pressing Enter. The last thing I need to do now is just crop in a bit. And yeah, just crop in as far as I need to lose those edges, and I'm basically done here. So I think now it's time to show you the before and after for the creative processing, which I did right after this step. So now here's the image which I have in the final master file, and the master file just consists of two layers. So I have the base layer and the final layer, and yeah, it's basically a destructive workflow I'm using. I don't need all the individual layers in between, and also have a separate video on this, why I do it like this, and if you want you can have a look at this. But let me just show you the difference between the start here and the final image, and you can see I worked a lot on the mood So for example, this image is much brighter than it actually was at that time of the blue hour. Usually I take my photos as bright as possible without clipping any highlights, so exposing to the right, and then in post I darken it to better fit what I actually saw. And I worked a lot on colors, so working on color contrast, on normal contrast, trying to guide the viewer into the image. And yeah, I show this in many of my tutorials, and also I have to plug my longer tutorials again here. So if you're really interested in the details, then head over to my homepage where you'll find a whole set of start to finish tutorials which are more than 2 hours in length, and you'll learn a lot there, all of my techniques. So not only the workflow, but each step I'm doing, and a lot of stuff I've not shown here on YouTube yet. And also what I want to show you, let's do a little pixel peeping here, because I find on the web, I think every photo looks sharp on the web, but you never know if it's actually sharp. So let's go in and do 100% pixel peeping here, and I hope this comes over in the YouTube video. But looking at this photo, it's a 75 megapixel file now, and I can look at it at 100% on my monitor, and this would equal to a print which is larger than 72 inch. So it's really sharp throughout, and yeah, this was important, and this was also the reason why I went through all this hassle with the tilt shift lens, with the focus stacking, with the exposure blending. And yeah, in the end, having all those 29 frames I started with and coming to this end result, it was worth it. It was a lot of work, but I could now print this very large, and this is what it's all about, and this is what my workflow and processing is tuned for. So I hope you liked this tutorial, although I didn't show so many post-processing tricks or steps. It was more about the workflow and the approach, so the different steps from going from 29 photos to the final single picture. Yeah, I hope this was interesting for you, and yeah, see you in the next video.